Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Many fundamentalist Christians believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis. But what does literal mean? Is that actually 7 days or 7,000 years? Or what is that exactly? In our next conversation with Ben Spackman, we'll talk about that question and we'll find out that the meaning of literal has literally changed over the years. Check out our conversation. I'd like to encourage you, if you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe on our Patreon page at patreon.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe for $5 a month and get the entire interview uncut. We can also have you subscribe for some additional options for $10 to $20 a month. So check out patreon.com/gospeltangents. Now back to our conversation.
Let me shift a little bit onto the idea of a literal reading, because a lot of times people say, well, this is what a literal reading of Genesis says. And the idea of a literal reading goes way, way back to Augustine, actually. He wrote a 2-volume commentary on Genesis that he called literal commentary. And what he meant by that is very clear. At his time in Christianity, they were very much into... there's a technical term for it, and I'm forgetting it. It's not quite metaphor. It's not. They had 4 ways of reading Scripture, and this is one of them. Anyway, it doesn't matter. When he says, I want a literal, what he is saying is, I want to read this according to the author's intent. What did the author intend this to be? Now, Augustine's already 1,000 years removed from this Babylonian context. He has no way of providing an actual literal interpretation because he can't get into the mind of the author. He doesn't have access to the Babylonian material. He doesn't have access to any of that stuff. A literal reading, and you can find this in the Catholic Catechism as well, a literal reading is a reading that gets at what the author intended. It's a deeply contextual reading. It requires some expertise. It means reading poetry as poetry, reading fiction as fiction, reading history as history. It doesn't mean a surface reading without context. It doesn't mean a scientific reading. It means reading according to the author's intent. So if I have a poem and I try to read that poem as history, that's not a literal reading. If I have a history that I try to read as metaphor, that's not a literal reading. If I have a non-natural philosophy creation account that I try to read as scientific history, that's not a literal reading. That's a misreading. A literal reading, I'm paraphrasing John Walton here, a literal reading requires knowledge of Hebrew and other things. But again, our modern idea of literal reading, that I can read it, I can understand it, I don't need a priest or a pastor or an academic to tell me what it means. It's part of the populist 19th century anti-clerical stuff that carries over. And it's not helpful to us. The idea that person A, reading in English 3,000 years removed from these things with no context, will understand it the way the author intended, the way the first people heard it, is implausible, let's say kindly. But so how does this fit into kind of LDS history? Joseph Smith had 2 competing instincts. On the one hand, he was very populist. That's evident in a couple of places. On the other hand, he studied Hebrew. He did a tiny bit of Greek. He did a little German. He gets asked once about how do you interpret this, and he says, well, read it in context. Is how I would paraphrase. He says, well, look at the question, how do you interpret this parable? Look at the question that drew it out. Look to context to interpret and understand. And the impulse to context, to Hebrew, to all that kind of thing, I think that kind of died with Joseph Smith. The populism continued. There's a lot of distrust of experts, of academics, especially academics who have things to say about the Bible, right? And so the first Mormon to really go do this stuff is Sidney Sperry at Chicago, gets his PhD in 1930. And so I don't know what exactly he studied, but by 1930, they've got 30, 40 good years of studying Akkadian, studying the Assyrian Babylonian material. And so while Protestants and Catholics are really wrestling with this material, Mormons are dealing with the U.S. government marching out to Utah with the army, with polygamy and statehood, with various things. And so it's 100 years from Joseph Smith organizing the church to the first guy who could possibly get at this ancient context for Genesis. And at that point, you've got deeply embedded in Mormonism, you've got the populism, you've got 100 years of tradition of interpreting Genesis in a way that is hostile to evolution, that relies very heavily on literal readings. Plus, you have the similar creation accounts in Moses and Abraham and the temple, which seem to say whatever Genesis is saying is right. So since they assume that Genesis is history, that kind of gives it more weight. I just talked about this at the Joseph Smith Papers Conference. I'll probably be doing it again in August at a different venue. What's the relation between Genesis, Moses, Abraham, and the temple? How should we think of those in Revelation? And so by the time... So you get Sidney Sperry as the first in 1930, which is the time that you have these three guys trained in science, well, two guys trained in science, Talmage and Whitsoe, and Roberts, who was an autodidact but brilliant, arguing with Joseph Fielding Smith over this stuff. None of them really make any use of the Babylonian material at all. Whitsoe is aware of it, vaguely, but he's pushing back against the scholars who are saying, oh, well, clearly the Jews just copied. So this kind of stuff is nowhere near, even today, the general knowledge of your average Latter-day Saint when going to Genesis. It does show up in a couple places, most recently in the fantastic book, it was Deseret book a couple years ago, 2010, 2011, Jehovah in the World of the Old Testament, Pike, Seeley, and Holtz-Offel, where they have a section on Genesis, and they say, I mean, this is a paragraph, but it's the best paragraph on this in Mormon writing for a long time, where they say, in the last 150 years, archaeology and philology have been able to give us a lot of creation accounts that the Israelites might have known and shown us what creation accounts did in the ancient world, and they've shed lots of light on Genesis, and they kind of leave it there. And so all of that is to say, I fully believe Scripture, but I am completely fine with evolution because the way I understand Genesis, as well as Moses and Abraham and the temple, they don't have anything to say about the age of the earth or evolution. They essentially live in different boxes. You know, it's like baseball scores have nothing to say about what I'm eating for breakfast. They're different things. They don't have to be reconciled. They have nothing to do with each other. That's a little bit of exaggeration, perhaps. They do have something to do with each other, just not remotely what people think, and to the same extent. Mm-hmm. And in my talks with various people, there are a lot of people who say, oh, evolution, is that still an issue? I have no idea. But I can tell you, it very much, evolution and the way it's been handled in the church very much are an issue for people. At least the people who it's an issue for, it's a very big issue. And there have been a couple of significant times that people have left the church and the core issue was evolution, and that have caused some real problems. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to kind of the fundamental, well, if evolution is true, how could Joseph Fielding Smith as a prophet be a young earth creationist? And I say, okay, that's where we need to sit down and talk about what is the nature of prophets? What do prophets know? How do they know that? This is an epistemological issue, which is a history of science thing. How do we know what we know? What is knowledge? And how does that work with prophets? What do prophets know?
Well, and it seems like there's kind of two problems that I see within the church. You have some people that I believe in evolution and Joseph Fielding Smith is wrong, and so I'm going to leave the church. You also have the other issue, which I think is more prevalent among active Mormons. You'll go to a gospel doctrine class and somebody's going to teach a literal reading, a young earth, I'll put it that way, a young earth interpretation of Genesis, and to me, they are the loudest and the most obnoxious people.
Right.
And I remember at that Joseph Smith Papers conference, somebody said, how do you deal with those kind of people? And I remember your answer, you said, with guile.
Well, I said several things. I said very carefully.
Yes.
But a lot of times, it was a humorous comment.
Yes.
But a lot of times I have found that if you can lead those people to a place where they are recognizing, I have made a particular assumption. Can I justify that assumption? Where did that assumption come from? Then the issue kind of takes care of itself. Instead of going head on and saying, well, you're wrong because science with a capital S, right?
So what are some,
that doesn't get anywhere.
What are some of those ways that you can take somebody who's maybe a young earth creationist, Latter-day Saint, and help them to see, to perhaps persuade them in a different direction?
Well, if they're Latter-day Saint, I do a couple things. One, I point out that the church has no revealed position on it. And this is something I do in my book.
Mormon doctrine does.
Right. I'll say there's been a spectrum of interpretations of Genesis. On one far end, you have Joseph Fielding Smith, who said, this is revelation. That means it's factual. It's science and it's history. On the far other end, you have Brigham Young, who says Genesis is baby stories. The Israelites asked Moses a question, and he answered them according to their folly. He doesn't even really seem to think that Genesis is revelation. He doesn't attach much importance to it. And it might or might not be significant that he says this at a time before Moses and Abraham really have any hold in LDS culture, because, the Pearl of Great Price comes later, right? They've been published in the newspapers, but who knows? And in the middle, you have David O. McKay. David O. McKay agreed with Joseph Fielding Smith that Genesis was revelation. He disagreed that because it was revelation, that entailed that it was scientific and factual. And he did this several times and in several places that we can talk about more. So I say, okay, there's no revealed position on this. No one has claimed revelation for their position, with one exception. That exception was Elder Packer at BYU when he gave a talk, and he laid out 5 or 6 reasons against evolution, and the 6th, he said, was personal revelation. And this is where it got interesting, because he said, I did not ask how man was created, but I asked if the scriptures were true. And when he got a positive answer, he concluded from that evolution had to be false. And that is where I jump in and I say, there's this whole issue of how do we interpret Scripture? How do we understand Scripture? We get into what does a literal reading mean? What role does context play? This is not something we've really done in the church much. There is no model of how to interpret Scripture in church magazines and church manuals. You do have some gestures towards Scripture should be interpreted in context, but we have never really shown the work that goes into actually interpreting Scripture to get at a literal meaning. What did Isaiah mean to Isaiah? What did Genesis mean to the Israelites? We don't show the work that goes into that. And so people think that it's just all surface reading. And I think that's what Elder Packer was doing when he said the Scriptures are true, therefore evolution must be false. And I would say I've got a whole lot of very deeply committed Jewish and Christian scholars who read Scripture extremely closely in the original languages, and Pope John Paul II, who accept Scripture as infallible and are just fine with evolution. So there's a disconnect between Scripture is true, therefore evolution is false. So the one exception to no one's ever claimed revelation on the question of evolution, the only one is Elder Packer. So I say, okay, we have no revealed official position on how to read Genesis. So you can interpret Genesis in a variety of ways. You've got this whole spectrum to play with. You can be young earth creationists, justify it. You could call it baby stories and cite Brigham Young and justify it. I don't see that very much in the church, but so that's the first way. I say, look, you can think that if you want. That's an acceptable position within the range of LDS positions, but historically there's been a range of positions. And most people will admit that. The ones who don't, you can't work with them. People who simply deny the data in front of them, deny that the data exists, right? You just can't make any headway. So that's usually my first one.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ben Spackman. In our next conversation, we'll talk about President McKay's views on evolution.
Because President McKay, on several occasions, was very friendly to evolution.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ben Spackman. We'll have a transcript out shortly on this conversation, and you can purchase individual copies at our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. If you want to be the first to get a copy, please subscribe on our website for just $10 a month. I'll send it to you first as a PDF. Or if you'd like a physical copy, for $15 a month, I'll be happy to send that to you as well. You can get our transcripts at our Amazon.com author page. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you should be able to find a bunch of them there. Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. And for $10, you can get a PDF copy. We've also got a $15 tier where if you want a physical copy, I'll be the first to send it to you. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.